Hello, everyone. Welcome. We'll give a moment for folks to come in from the waiting room. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Susanna Hermans, co-owner of Oblong Books in New York's Hudson Valley. We are delighted this evening to welcome author and one of my favorite people in the universe, Cy Montgomery, and celebrate the publication of her new book, The Hawk's Way, Encounters with Fierce Beauty, the story of Cy's visit to falconer Nancy Cowan's farm and her encounter with Jazz, a feisty 4-year-old female hawk, which is out this week from Simon & Schuster. For those not familiar with Cy's work, she's a naturalist, documentary scriptwriter, and author of 31 acclaimed books of nonfiction for adults and children, including The Hummingbirds Gift, The Soul of an Octopus, a National Book Award finalist, and the memoir, The Good Good Pig, which was a New York Times bestseller. Conducting the conversation with Cy this evening is award-winning author, teacher, and conservationist Kathryn J. Schneider. A native of the Hudson Valley, Kathryn is also past president of the New York State Ornithological Association. Her book, Birding the Hudson Valley, is an invaluable resource for anyone wanting to know more about the birds in our area. Copies of The Hawk's Way and Birding the Hudson Valley are available in our stores and online through oblongbooks.com. And I'll post links in the chat for those of you who'd like to purchase a copy. We do have signed book plates for Cy's book. And after our folks have a great discussion, we're going to open up to Q&A. So throughout the event, if you think of questions for our authors, drop them into the chat or in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them toward the end of the program. Welcome, Cy and Kathryn. Thank you for joining us. I will hand it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I've been so looking forward to this, not just to visit with my friends at Oblong Books, one of my very favorite bookstores, which unfortunately is a bit of a drive, but I was thrilled to be paired with Kathryn Schneider, who's a perennial bestseller at the bookstore and an actual ornithologist. And she has all kinds of wonderful experiences that I'm dying to know about, especially, well, gosh, she's done research with woodpeckers and with sparrows, and she's had quite a bit of hands-on experience with hawks as well. So thank you so much, Kathryn, for joining me tonight.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
So, gosh, I wonder, we were talking a little earlier, and I learned a bit about your ornithology background. And you went to Cornell in the 70s and worked in a hawk barn with peregrines. Well, let's start talking about hawks. I would love to hear about some of the hawks, some of the peregrines that you got to know and your experiences with them. And then I can share some of the experiences that I've had with peregrines and other hawks as well.
Well, I was an undergraduate at Cornell, and by the time I got to my senior year, I knew that you might actually be able to make a living studying birds. So I figured I needed to separate the rest of I needed to separate myself from the pack of other people that knew birds at Cornell. So I did an undergraduate research project, and I was fortunate that I took my ornithology class as a junior from Tom Cade, who's very famous for the Peregrine project at Cornell and reintroducing peregrines to the wild when they became imperiled through DDT contamination. And basically my study was to try and understand the vocalizations of peregrine falcons. So this was in the 70s. So if you wanted to study vocalizations, then you took a huge tape recorder with real tapes on it, and you hung it in close to the birds, and you record what they were saying and try and associate their vocalizations with various kinds of behaviors. So I would record these vocalizations at like 5 or 6 in the morning, and when they were just waking up, and then make visual pictures of them called sonograms that separated the calls, the various vocalizations, one from another. And I didn't get to know the birds that well, but it was a thrill to be able to watch these pairs as they courted in the hawk barn. They would put two birds together and they would do vocalizations called e-chips. They would bow one to another and do this courtship behavior. And it was a wonderful introduction. They had prairie falcons there and a few Harris's hawks, but they tried to stick to the ones that were closely related because the behaviors were similar.
Wow, gosh. Peregrines are so cool. The fastest bird in the world, as many of our readers may know, they've been clocked at over 200 miles an hour when they go into a stoop. And I just wonder, what's it like hurtling towards Earth at that incredible speed? And what's it like to have eyes and a brain that process everything that's flooding your senses at that moment? I've got to ask too, how many vocalizations did they seem to have, and were you able to decode sort of what they meant?
A little bit, but it was an undergraduate project and I was pretty naive. I think I got a B on the project, but it was just wonderful to spend time with the birds, and I made really good contacts with people who were also working in the hawk barn at that time. Peregrines really are, they used to be called duck hawks because they are, they hunt other birds, and specifically they can take birds as big as hawks. And that's one of the reasons they were so, you can probably fill in the blanks here, but they were among the most valued falcons for falconry because they could take big prey. You'd want to have a duck on your dinner table. And that's what how falconry evolved. It was usually a hunting practice.
Right. In fact, oddly, the peregrine was called the falcon gentle, even though they are not gentle at all. The reason they were called the falcon gentle was that gentle was like gentleman. It was for a gentleman, for someone of the gentry. My first experience up close and personal with a peregrine was really within minutes of starting my first falconry lesson. And it was a bloody introduction. I first was handed what I thought was the most beautiful bird in the world, who was a Harris's hawk named Jazz. And I just couldn't believe I had this gorgeous animal on my glove. I was the first student in the New Hampshire School of Falconry when it opened. I was the first student of Nancy Cowan, and I brought along a friend of mine, Celinda Chicoine, who was also handed a gorgeous bird, and her bird was a lanner falcon, but her bird was someone who had been living in captivity for quite a long time and actually was a pretty gentle bird. My bird, I was warned, was feisty. And Nancy, the instructor, took Banshee, the peregrine, and we start walking down the road, three ladies walking down the road with birds prey on our wrists, and Banshee turned and bit Nancy in the face. And this happened within the first 5 minutes of my lesson, and I'm like, oh my God, what kind of strange world is this? And a few minutes later, blood's coursing down her face, and cars are whipping by, and no one's looking twice. No one thinks anything odd about this. Then this car pulls over and someone rolls down the window and hands Nancy a dead woodcock. And I thought, oh my gosh, like blood and death. And I'm like this vegetarian my heart is hurt all day if I see a squirrel dead on the road. What am I doing? But I was so in love with that bird on my arm. I was so captivated by her wildness that I was willing, more than willing, eager and hungry to go into that world, even if it did contain blood and violence, and hunting was at the heart of it, even though no one would ever think of me as a hunter.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned earlier, that you actually handled some of the raptors in the raptor barn, and you had a bit of a bloody encounter too, didn't you?
Yes, I was stupid. I mean, they would leave some of the birds on perches around the barn to let them be outside and enjoy the sunshine. And they would, of course, be tethered to their perches. But, you would walk by these birds after having spent hours in the hawk barn making recordings. And, it was just sort of natural to want to touch them. But I put my hand out and immediately was scratched by the bird. It was silly, but I had a scar on my hand for years afterwards, and I kind of valued that scar as my experience in the hawk barn at Cornell.
Wow. Yeah, I'm very lucky. I was never bloodied by any of these birds, but they do teach you that they don't play by our rules, and that's something that Nancy really got across to me.
It's a natural instinct for the bird to reach out and claw anything that's approaching them. I mean, it's a defensive mechanism. And I mean, I've banded birds, and sometimes you get raptors in a mist net, and the first thing they do, they don't bite you with their beaks, they claw you with their talons. I mean, that's how they approach prey, and we're a threat, and it's not any different than anything else in the wild that's strange and unusual.
Right. But boy, you and I were talking a little earlier too about how birds of prey are just so different from other creatures who we're more used to. They're not like a dog or a cat. They're not like even an octopus. I've been so lucky knowing so many animals that I even got a rhinoceros to roll over for me once. It wasn't, a wild rhinoceros. It was somebody's rhinoceros. But boy, these birds don't like to be touched, do they? And you got to play by their rules. And it was so interesting for me in taking falconry to try to put myself in the mind of somebody whose agenda and whose rules were so different from anybody else I knew. Hawks were more different, I think, from my own worldview, my own Umwelt, even than the octopuses that I knew, who, are so distantly related to us. We share an ancestor that goes back 500 million years when everybody was a tube. But at least with an octopus, I know that an octopus will enjoy my gentle touch and will come to me and recognize me and want me to play with it and pet it. But that's not what a hawk wants.
Yeah.
They want a hunting partner that they can trust not to make a stupid mistake.
Yeah, I think I was impressed by, I've always been impressed by birds that are wild and are very different from us. Birds don't behave in ways that we anticipate unless we can put ourselves in their shoes about what is important to them. Food is important to them. Reproduction is important to them. Those are the things that are most important in terms of evolution and survival. And, affection from a human being is pretty low down the scale. The animals that appreciate humans are the ones that have been domesticated by us a lot of the time, that have spent a lot of time with us. So, dogs and cats, and even chickens can sometimes be affectionate, though they still run away from me, of course, in the yard. But they are more used to our presence, and they don't see us as a threat. But anything that has not been domesticated will see us as a threat most of the time. And I think
they're correct. I mean, look what we've done to bird populations.
Right.
They're crashing, literally crashing, and it's completely us.
Yeah, it's kind of sad. I'm a serious bird watcher, and it's always a thrill in May when the warblers and all the birds, the neotropical migrants that have been in the South all winter, start to come back. So the numbers are increasing dramatically now, but just to think that maybe 20 years ago, before I was a serious bird watcher, there were 10 times as many birds as there are now. That's really sad. It's really, really sad in a lot of ways. And a lot of we're responsible for a lot of it. So
what are some things, this would be a great thing for us to discuss too. What are some things that we can do to help bird populations?
Well, there are some really important things we can do. I mean, One of the most important things, of course, is to plant native plants, which attract native pollinators, because it's all about the insects. So these declines in bird population numbers are really related to insects, because birds, passerine birds at least, feed their young caterpillars. And caterpillars come from moths and from butterflies and things like that. And if we do not plant native plants, those butterflies and moths that use the plant materials to reproduce, the caterpillars eat native plants. They don't eat exotic plants. So planting things that belong in this area, that have been part of the ecosystem for thousands of years, is really, really important. This takes us away a bit from raptors, but it's all related to the food chain, because the birds that are often prey for the raptors are feeding on insects. So you have to think about the relationships between different individuals. So I would say planting native plants is a really important, and seeing to the survival of insects is critically important all the way up the food chain.
And native plants will do better in your yard than exotic plants.
That's right.
Because, you know, they evolved to be here. I did a book last year called the Hummingbirds Gift. And so many people love to have hummingbird feeders, and they're happily set out nectar. But unfortunately, while they're attracting them to have nectar, they don't realize that hummingbirds need like 500 bugs a day. And meanwhile, you know, they're not keeping a compost pile. They might even be spraying. And that, if it doesn't kill the hummingbirds outright, it kills the thing that they need, the protein that they need. And they desperately need it when they're feeding their babies too. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that. And some birders don't like hawks because they will haunt your bird feeder and eat your other birds.
Those guys got to eat too. That's what I always say to them. I think it's the problem is that bird feeders are often exposed, and that people do not put them in places where there's cover. I think you have to give the dicky birds a fair chance. And in order to give the little birds a fair chance, you have to provide them with a way to get away, some cover. But I think that sharp-shinned hawks and Cooper's hawks, which are the main perpetrators of bird feeder catches, have to eat too. And if they get a junco or a white-throated sparrow once in a while, good for them. I have seen so many misses. I'll tell you that an awful lot of first-year birds have a very hard time making it through that first winter. Plus, they're stymied by the fact that you know, we put our feeders close to windows, and the windows create reflections, and they sometimes crash into windows and get hurt. So I don't think we should resent the fact that they occasionally get a small bird as food. I mean, I think they're using a resource that they would normally, and trying to just survive through the winter.
And as we know from other studies of top predators, like the studies of the wolves in Yellowstone, once you knock out the predators, it wrecks everything, down to changing the chemistry of the soil and changing the chemistry of the waters. Even if the predator doesn't even go near the waters, it will change the fish species that live or don't live. It's amazing. And so all of these birds of prey, they're really keeping the world whole for us. And I mean, to me, a huge part of why they are so majestic, why they are such a thrill to see, has to do with the fact that they are such exquisite hunters. And that's what they were made to do. And then there's no evil in it. There's no it's pure and it's wild. And that's what really drew me to falconry. I love their ferocity. I find it beautiful and perfect. And to have a bird like that choose to land on your glove and to feel those strong yellow feet grip you. They are strong. And they smack on your falconry glove. It makes a loud noise. You just can't even believe it. There's a lot of people who would not want to try falconry, including a very brave biologist I know admits that he would be absolutely terrified. And he reminds me that our kind, or our ancestors, were once hunted by giant eagles. There's a famous fossil, I'm sure you know it, the Tong child. It's an ancient Australopithecine. And when you and I were going to college, it was thought this fossil, discovered by Raymond Dart, had been killed by a leopard. But then I later found that this had been revised, and they looked at the kill marks on the bones. And no, it was an eagle who had killed this little hominid. So no wonder we get a little nervous when they start coming towards us. But shock and awe, that's what we should feel. Just shock and awe that they are there at all. And for me to get to know several birds like this, enough that they wouldn't just scream how much they hated me. I spent several years, well, more than several years, because Nancy Cowan, my instructor, was also my friend. And long after I actually completed the experience that I write about in this book, I continued to go back and back. And to my immense sorrow, Nancy died in January of this year, and the book is dedicated to her. But I would hang out with her and her birds as frequently as I could. And every single time I was just mesmerized and humbled. And feeling humbled is one of those things that we humans need to do, I think, quite regularly to keep our place on this earth. I really want to ask you about woodpeckers. I mean, this is one of the species that you study, the red-bellied woodpecker, because we have some at our feeder, and I want to know what you found out.
Well, this was a project about climate change. Red-bellied woodpeckers are relatively new to our area. I don't know if you realize that 20 years ago, there weren't very many red-bellied woodpeckers here at all. They've been expanding their range northward in the last few years, and now they're all the way up into parts of Maine and Canada. But when I was a kid growing up in the Hudson Valley, we didn't have red-bellied woodpeckers. So this has been a noticeable change. And there are other birds that fit into this pattern. Birds like tufted titmouse also used to be uncommon. Even cardinals have expanded their range north. They're mostly birds of the mid-Atlantic states that are now moving up into New England and Canada. And so this project was a museum-based project where they have many study skins of woodpeckers. And the idea was to try and associate various physical characteristics with the expansion. So every specimen in a museum has the date and where it was collected and its location. And you can tell male and female red-bellied woodpeckers apart. So you can try and figure out who got here first, who started the expansion. Was it a boy or a girl? Things like, was it the younger birds or the older birds? Because you can age specimens as well. And you could measure them to see if there were physical differences between the colonists and the birds to the farther south. And that was what this project was all about. And it turned out some interesting things. It showed that the males are slightly bigger than the females. So they were better able.
Birds.
It's very slight differences, but they are enough that it shows up in things like wing measurements and bill measurements. So the males were better able to survive the winter because there's something called Glauger's rule in biology, or Bergman's rule in biology, where if you get a larger body size has a smaller surface to volume ratio, so you don't lose heat to the environment quite as fast. So being bigger is an ecological advantage in a cold climate. And you can see this in birds that have big expansive ranges. So for example, the blue jays and robins in Florida are little tiny birds compared to the ones we have up in the Adirondacks. And here, blue jays are big up here compared to the ones in Florida, for example. They're just little jobbies down there, but that's because it's mild down there. And large body size isn't necessary. But up here, having a big body allows you to preserve your heat inside your body, and it's a smaller amount of surface area over which to lose that heat. So it's not surprising that the birds that the red-bellied woodpeckers that were expanding their ranges tended to be the bigger birds. They were better adapted for the cold climates. And that was part of what that project was all about.
Wow, gosh, it's funny that the males were bigger. I mean, you would think that if you were going to preserve somebody, you'd want to preserve your females. But God knows what he's doing, right? Or be it for me. And did you find that it was the younger birds that were
often young birds that were so after breeding takes place, the young birds get kicked out of the home territories. Mom and dad don't want them. They want them leave the nest, so to speak. And yeah, they kick them out. And so it tends to be the younger birds that are expanding their range north.
Mm. Well, I mean, as you certainly know, and many of our audience may know, in hawks, the females are significantly larger.
And in fact, that's unusual in the bird world. There are only a few families of birds where the females are bigger.
Oh, okay.
Sandpipers, I mean, there are a few other groups, but you can count them on one hand how many times the females are bigger than the males.
Yeah, in mammals, usually the males are bigger than the females, as is the case with most humans too.
Right.
I would think in some cases, I can see how it would be an advantage to be bigger, maybe if you nested alone, if you didn't have somebody helping you. I forget how it is. Do you know how it is with hummingbirds?
I don't know. I don't think there's a significant difference in size in hummingbirds.
Because the mom just takes care of there's no help from dad in hummingbirds.
Yeah.
Gosh, hawk watching. Before and while I've been learning falconry, I often loved watching these birds on their migration, particularly right now.
Yeah.
The broadwings are just flooding back to New England and up the Hudson Valley, I reckon too. Are you seeing a lot of broadwings right now?
We're seeing a lot of broadwings, yep.
And you hear them. Can you do their whistle?
No, but it's a real simple 2-note whistle.
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm not doing it very well.
And I'll tell you that blue jays do a very good imitation.
Oh, I know it. I'm like, wait, is that actually a broadwing or is it a blue jay imitating? Yeah, but if you see the animal, it's pretty clear which one it is. Oh my gosh. So where we live, we have 3 birds who have been radio collared right from our area, satellite collared. And it's so much fun watching them. They went down to Colombia. All 3 of them went to Colombia, but some of our broadwings go to Peru and Brazil and other places like that. And you can actually follow them on a website and see where they are.
Right.
And I had the honor of releasing a broadwing this past fall, and this is in part of the introduction to the book. I had no idea. I just went up to the top of the mountain to watch the migration, and it was the day that some rehabilitated birds were going to be let go. And my friend Julie, who was kind of presiding over it, turned to me and said, "Would you like to release this broadwing?" And it was so different from falconry. In falconry, you're never going to put your hands over the bird's wings, but you have to if you're going to hold the bird, and it doesn't have any jesses on, which of course wild bird did not. And the bird turned its head and screamed into my face. I was so appalled, but I could just feel where that bird wanted to go.
Right.
And being able to and I don't know what sex this bird was. It was an immature, but being able to set her free and know that she was joining these tens of thousands of birds on this epic journey, just being a tiny part of that, even though that bird could care less about me. If anything, she hated me or he hated me, but I'll remember that for the rest of my life.
Hawk watches are wonderful places to visit. In my book about birding the Hudson Valley, I tried to identify a number of these places where you can go to particularly witness the hawk migration. Hawks migrate, back and forth, 2 times a year, in the spring and in the fall, and they follow weather fronts. And hawks, because they soar and rely on the uplift of thermals, tend to accumulate along particular pathways. So you can observe this hawk migration as it takes place in the Northeast on the tops of mountains, because the birds tend to accumulate in those places. Or there are places where they don't want to cross water. They tend to stay overland because that's where their food's available. So they'll take a turn on the North Shore of Long Island so they can stay over the land. And there are places where you can go to see large numbers of hawks if the wind is right and migration is taking place. So thousands and thousands of hawks, mostly broadwings, but there are also big migrations of turkey vultures, which leave our area in the winter, and red tails and goshawks and lots of other birds. That red-shouldered hawks leave our area because they feed primarily on cold-blooded things like snakes and frogs, which aren't available in winter. So they go south for the winter, and then they come north in the spring. And you can watch these hawk migrations, and it's a very interesting kind of bird watching, because you can just lie on the top of the mountain in a chaise lounge or a reclining chair with your binoculars and watch these birds go over. And there are people that are very, very good at identifying birds by their flight pattern, by the shape of their wings and their tail. And so seasoned bird watchers can say, that's a goshawk or that's a broadwing. And there are huge numbers of hawks going over. It's a really lazy way of bird watching, because hawks don't get going until 10 or 11 in the morning, when the earth heats up, and because the sun has been on it, and the warm air starts to rise, and now they have currents that they can fly on. So you can go late in the day, and peak is often around 11 or sometimes 10 in the morning. And you can just, on a good day, you can see thousands of hawks migrate over these sites. So there's places like Chestnut Ridge Hawk Watch that contributes. They have paid counters that actually keep track of the number of birds that fly over. There's places like Cook Mountain in Rockland County, or the Helderberg Hawk Watch at Thatcher Park in Albany County. And there are people there who count the birds and contribute data to the Hawk Migration Association of North America to monitor the populations of various groups of migrating hawks. And it's a great way to watch birds, to learn how to distinguish one raptor from another, and to contribute data to the conservation of raptors in North America.
And it's such a wonderful thing to not just see a bird like, oh, that's what that is. Oop, that's what that is. But you're watching birds do this heroic journey, this epic journey. You're seeing tigers of the air flying over. You're seeing, really flying dinosaurs, because of course, these are the descendants of the theropod dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus Rex and Velociraptor, and they're flying over your head. It's an amazing thing to be part of that migration. And I love this time of year when they're coming back to us, and it just feels like they're flooding back, filling our forests up again with life and drama. And soon they'll be building their nests and making more hawks for us.
Right.
I wonder if we should do some Q&A at this point. Susanna, what do you think?
Yes, let's do it. Oh my goodness, this is such a wonderful conversation. I feel like I've learned so much already, and I know that folks have some great questions for you too. So let's start with Pat. Pat has a couple questions. Pat's interested in finding out what brought each of you to the world of birds. And their other question is, if you happen to know, Pat lives in Florida and wants to know what other types of hawks and falcons they can look out for in Florida.
Wow.
Wow.
Do you want to start, Kathryn?
Well, I'll just say my mom was a bird watcher. And that's part, I was raised in an outdoorsy family, and bird watching was always part of my life growing up. There was a field guide in the house. And then, so I started out as a biology major when I went to college. And of course, when you go to Cornell, Cornell has a long history of ornithology, and I just couldn't help but get trapped by birds. I mean, I took an ornithology class and it was all downhill. Then about my senior year, I learned you might be able to make a living studying birds. And then there was just no question what I was going to do. So.
Well, that's lucky for us. For me, gosh, I mean, I always loved animals of all kinds. And actually, the first male to make love to me was a parakeet. His name was Jerry, and he threw up on my finger, and I was enchanted. So that was as a child. I always loved birds, but my first actual like field science experience in my 20s, after I'd worked for a newspaper for 5 years, I had this experience. I went and joined Earthwatch and did an expedition in Australia, and basically was invited to come back, although I couldn't, there was no way for me to get paid for it, and I had to buy my own ticket, but I had an opportunity to study anything I wanted if I quit my job and moved to a tent in the outback. So I did. And of course, and studied emus. I spent 6 months following these. I'm sure most of our audience here knows emus are tall as a person almost. They can run 40 miles an hour. Their legs are strong enough to sever fencing wire with a single kick. They do not fly, and they're related to ostriches and rheas and cassowaries and the extinct moa. So I was pretty crazy about birds from then on. When I began researching this book, I was very interested in what made a bird a bird. And I wrote this book called Birdology. And I picked several different species that illustrated a different aspect of birdiness. I wrote about hummingbirds to illustrate that birds are made of air. They're all filled with air sacs and lungs and a giant heart, and it's their fragility that gives them their strength. I wrote about parrots to illustrate how very smart birds can be. I mean, certain parrots can speak to you meaningfully in English. As Dr. Irene Pepperberg, my friend now, has shown with her parrots. Birds are the wild animals we see every day, and they are ubiquitous, which we can see in animals like in birds like crows. And for falconry, what I wanted to get at was that bird ferocity, you know, their essential wildness that you and I started talking about in this conversation. And that was what I was doing kind of with the falconry lessons, and getting to understand a mind wholly unlike my own.
I would just add that one of the things that attracted me to birds rather than other kinds of animals is their amazing adaptations. I mean, when you become a biologist and you learn how various organisms function and how their bodies work, birds are so different from all other kinds of organisms. I mean, they have everything about them is about being able to fly. Just feathers are amazing adaptations. They insulate birds against, negative temperatures. Up here in the Northeast, these little tiny birds are able to live outside when we cannot. So feathers and their ability to breathe, they have a very high metabolic rate. Their body temperature is higher than ours, but they can survive in unbelievable temperatures, and they can produce, 5 young a year for 12 years if they live that long. Their adaptations, their ability to migrate, all those things are absolutely amazing. And no other group of organisms that I'm aware of have such amazing physiological adaptations.
I have read elsewhere that for most birds, their feathers outweigh their skeleton. They're so important.
Very well.
And I love feathers. And when you think of it, what is your warmest coat made out of? Made out of down. And you can see how feathers evolve. We now know, I mean, when you and I were little, did you play with dinosaurs, by the way, plastic dinosaurs when you were a kid? Like,
Oh,
I did?
sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Dinosaur books, yeah.
yeah, I loved them, but
Mm.
we didn't know then that Tyrannosaurus
didn't.
Rex had hatched out of the egg covered with down.
Right.
We didn't know that a lot of dinosaurs had feathers, and we now know not only that they had feathers, but we know what color some of their feathers were.
Yeah.
So there's this direct link to this thing that we thought was extinct 65 million years ago. But instead, you're eating one at Thanksgiving and feeding them sunflower seeds out your window.
I'll take a stab at the second part of the question about what things you might see in Florida. If I was going to Florida and wanted to see cool raptors, I would look for kites. There are swallowtail kites there and snail kites. You have to get there a particular time of the year to see them, and they're only in certain places. But kites are raptors that are only found in Florida during the breeding season, and I've missed them every time I've been to Florida. So good luck seeing them.
Thank you, Kathryn. That's fantastic. So we have a couple of questions from Bree. I'm going to start with the one for Kathryn. Bree says, I'm a licensed falconer from the Hudson Valley. I work with a male red-tailed hawk. Heinz Mang's legacy inspired me to pursue falconry.
Mhm.
Though he taught at my university, I never got to meet him. I was wondering if you knew him and if you could speak a little about him.
I never met him. I only heard a lot about him. He taught at New Paltz for many years, I believe. And he was a good friend of Tom Cade, who was my ornithology professor. And they worked together on the Peregrine project here in New York. But sadly, I never got to meet him. I'm sorry.
It's all right. And Bree's question for Cy. You speak about the rules of raptors, wherein their body language is so different from animals we commonly encounter. When writing about birds of prey, do you ever find yourself anthropomorphizing them? Or is it easy to avoid doing so because they are so different from domesticated animals?
That anthropomorphizing is such an interesting idea. I mean, I know as scientists, folks are, I mean, that's like the worst thing you can do. For a long time, though, I think people made a mistake. They went too far the other way and denied that anybody but humans could think and feel and know. But to do that is to deny evolution, of course, unless you want to believe that this just consciousness arose de novo. But you're also very smart to point out that their desires are different from our desires. And I think my experience, I've been a human my whole life, but did not identify as a human. When I was a little girl, I informed my parents as soon as I could speak that I was really a horse. And they took me to the pediatrician, who reassured my mother that I'd get over it. And I did when I told them that, no, I was really a dog. So human motives still come as a big surprise to me. Happily, I think the open mind welcome mat is rolled out every time I see an animal. Whatever they do is going to be okay with me. And because I don't want them to do one thing or another, I don't pretend that an animal instantly loves me, or that the animal is there to teach me some kind of a lesson or bring me some kind of a message. They're their own creatures, like Henry Beston said in his wonderful book, The Outermost House. They are other nations. And the differences that these animals have thrill me as much as our shared evolutionary heritage. We share a ton of genetic material with just about everybody, like 40% of a banana we share. We should be able to understand a banana very well.
Amazing. We have a couple more questions, and I'll mention if anyone has question that you'd like to ask, please drop it into the chat or use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Bud says, hello from Buffalo. Sai, at this point, how do you go about picking the subject for the next book?
Sorry, I was fading into darkness. Now I think I'm blasting into something else, but sorry.
Looks good, looks
Is
good.
that better?
Yeah, that's good. And the sun's going down over here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice to have natural light, but not when you can't see anybody. Anyway, so how do I figure out what to write about next? Oh gosh, I feel like I get these things just land in my lap. I have a million ideas, but when I started out, I was very, I was very careful and tried to be shrewd about what I wrote about first and second and third and fourth. My first book was an homage to my heroines, Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey, and Brute Caldecott. I felt very much that I wanted to write that sort of to lay it at their feet as my thank you. And that was going to be my first book. And writing about them and how they changed the whole study of ethology by getting to know their study subjects as individuals and not just to understand the chimpanzee or the gorilla. They understood that, like us, they are individuals, and that's essential to understanding how they function both as individuals and as a group. I got very interested in human relationships with animals and saw how one of the first things that humans do when we come to a new area is we eradicate all the predators. So my second book was about humans and predators, specifically tigers, and specifically in an area where the tigers will swim out after your boat and get on board and eat you, the only place in the world where this happens. Well, while I was there researching that book in India and Bangladesh, I came across Gangetic dolphins in the rivers. And that led to my third book on pink dolphins in the Amazon. And it just started to snowball. Then, I was talking about the Amazon book at a zoo in Rhode Island and met this lady who studied tree kangaroos in Papua New Guinea, and she invited me to go there. And when I was in the Amazon, I met this man who was a biologist at the Field Museum, and he had always wondered about this strange golden moon bear he'd seen in China, and I ended up actually finding what that thing was with him in Southeast Asia, and so on and so on and so on. And the books kind of landed in my lap until Soul of an Octopus. Soul of an Octopus, I waited till 2011 to write that book and wanted to write about marine invertebrates for a very long time. But I don't think I was skilled enough to write that book until 2011. And I don't think I was bold enough to try to make friends with a marine invertebrate until I had, 25 books under my belt.
Fantastic. So, another question from Andrew. What are your opinions on keeping birds as pets? Do you feel people can give birds the proper environment in a house?
Do you want to take a stab at that first, or do you want me to, Kathryn?
Well, I'll try. I think it depends on the bird. I mean, some birds are easily domesticated and can be perfectly happy as cage birds. I mean, I think I learned a great deal about birds from the birds that I kept as pets. I kept zebra finches and parakeets and even my chickens. I think everybody who's interested in birds should have chickens, because chickens teach you a tremendous amount about birds in general, but they are not wild birds. And wild birds are very different. I mean, a lot of these birds that have lived in captivity for a long time are perfectly comfortable as pets and comfortable around us, but others are not. And I would not keep wild birds as pets most of the time. Sometimes if you raise them from eggs, I know people that have raised starlings and raised crows and kept them as pets. They can adapt, but they're definitely happier in the wild.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear you answer that. I'm so glad to hear that question, Andrew. Thank you for caring about the welfare of these animals. And boy, Kathryn, you're absolutely right on everything I would say. And I would also add about falconry. Some people believe that falconers are keeping their birds in captivity as pets, but they're not. You are the junior hunting partner. And when you go out hunting with your hawk, at any point that hawk can leave you. And they sometimes do. And another thing to remember if you're doing falconry, these are wild birds, and the things that befall wild birds can happen to them. You can take your falconry bird out hunting, and it has happened to many a falconer, including my instructor, Nancy, that your wild hawk that you may have even raised as she did from a young chick. She took one of her birds out one day hunting and saw a big red tail. She tried to call her bird down to her glove. The bird was too afraid. She chased after the bird who was chasing after her red tail. She finally flagged down a truck so she could basically hitch a ride to get to where the birds were. She found the red tail sitting in the tree looking a lot fatter than it was before. And that was the end of her bird. So it's dangerous being a wild bird. And falconry birds are essentially wild birds. And they choose to stick around you if you improve their chances of hunting success. There's a wonderful book called A Rage for Falcons. And have you read that, Kathryn?
No, I haven't.
Audio. Oh my God, you would love it. He was a falconer, is a falconer. He's still with us. And in it, he describes some wild hawks who would fly out of the woods and into a car to go hunting with their human hunting partner, who would then, after the hunt, let them fly right out of the car and go back, roosting in the woods. But they chose to be with that human hunting partner. And that to me is like the essence of what you're doing when you're doing falconry. You are letting them be the boss. You are being the bird's servant, essentially. And you are not the boss of them.
Interesting.
Fantastic. We're getting close to the end. I wanted to ask you a question, Sai. Many of us know you from your grown-up books, but you are an extraordinarily prolific author of kids nonfiction. And I don't know so much that I have a question, but I just want to thank you for all the work that you've done to create the next generation of environmentalists, of ecologists, of biologists, of people who will go through their life loving animals. So thank you for that.
Oh, Susanna, thank you so much. And I have a new book out this spring just for little people, which you may have.
I'm sure I do.
You do. It's The Seagull and the Sea Captain, and it's a little picture book.
I'm going to throw that in the chat in just a moment. I love it. Well, I thought I might wrap things up by reading a comment in the chat from, I'm not sure if it's pronounced Jamie or Jaime, but they have such a beautiful thing to say, and I thought I would read it. Sai, thank you so much. Listening to you speak is always such a joy. I love the respect and perspective you share on animals. You are one of the most magical and inspiring people I've ever heard and read. Thank you. And I could not agree with those words more. Thank you both for the work that you do, for the books that you make, for getting us all excited to go outside and explore our world. You guys are the best. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Susanna. This was wonderful. And thank you to all these great folks who joined us tonight.
Yes, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Bye.